Now, it is my honor to introduce our guest, Dr. Fernando Reimers. Professor Reimers is the Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Education and Director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative at Harvard University. He's an elected member of the US National Academy of Education and of the International Academy of Education. An expert in the field of global education, his research and teaching focus on understanding how to educate children and youth so they can thrive in the 21st century. He was a member of UNESCO's Commission on the Futures of Education, which wrote the report, Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education. He was a member of the advisory committee of the UN Education Summit. He has also developed a curriculum aligned with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which is in use in many schools throughout the world. During the COVID-19 pandemic, he led numerous comparative studies examining the educational consequences of the pandemic and identifying options to sustain educational opportunity and to build back better. He directs the Global Education Innovation Initiative, a cross-country research and practice collaborative focusing on education for the 21st century. He has written or edited 45 books and over 100 articles and chapters, including Education to Build Back Better, Primary and Secondary Education During COVID-19, and University and School Collaborations During a Pandemic. He has also authored several children's books focused on inclusive values. As part of his commitment to advancing educational opportunity, he serves on multiple advisory boards and committees at Harvard, particularly focused on advancing the global mission of the university and enhancing the effectiveness of the university's programs to address climate change. He also serves on the boards of a range of education organizations focused on the improvement of education and the promotion of peace, inclusion, and sustainability. He has served on the Harvard faculty since 1998. Previous to that, he worked at the Universidad Central de Venezuela, the Harvard Institute for International Development, and the World Bank. Professor Reimers, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Prachi, thank you so very much. And thank you so very much for joining us from Dubai, where it's 3 a.m. for you. And thank you so much, Zaina, also for your leadership in organizing that. And thanks to all of you who are giving me the privilege of having a conversation with you tonight. So I'm going to share some slides so that I can talk for about 25, 30 minutes, share some ideas, and then leave plenty of time for a conversation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about this notion of what does it mean to educate students to improve the world. So let me first confirm that you can indeed see my screen on presentation mode. Can you? Are you seeing on presentation mode?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. So I'm going to divide this presentation in 5 steps. I'm going to talk about why is it important to try to work to make education relevant. I'm going to suggest that big, ambitious goals are one way to open the doors and windows of schools and educational institutions to the world. I'm going to talk about how critical supporting teachers to develop the capacities to educate students holistically and to develop the competency to reach those ambitious goals to make the world better. And then I'm going to talk about a little bit about the process of scaling educational change. And I'm going to conclude presenting a framework, which is a framework that is designed to be a tool for communication. So let me begin with the challenge of making education authentic and relevant. I mean, obviously, educational institutions exist to serve some purposes, but sometimes we get on autopilot and we think that the purpose of schools is to get students to learn that which is in the curriculum or to get them to transition from one grade to the next or to the next level or even to go to college. Yes, Prachi?
So sorry, but could you toggle your presentation so that, because right now it's in presenter mode.
It is in presenter mode, all right? And so I guess my question is, what do I need to do to put it on presentation mode? Let me just see. Not sure I'm going to be able to do that, but I'm going to try.
Yeah, just go to
there you go. How about now? Is that better now?
Much better. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prachi. Thank you. So the first step is crises like COVID in many ways are a silver lining, or provide the opportunity of a silver lining, because they cause us to ask, how important is it to teach at this moment of crisis? And what should we teach? And who should we prioritize? What should we prioritize? And what I want to suggest is that we should be in that mode of asking the question of what is the end to which we educate often, not only in crisis. And I think if we did that for many educational institutions, we will find that there is a lot of room for improvement in schools, that schools are on autopilot, essentially confusing means with ends. And to quote Albert Einstein, we're not going to solve problems with the same kind of thinking that we used when we created those problems. And so what would one of the goals of the Global Education Innovation Initiative that that I lead is to try to generate some knowledge that can inform those aspirations, the aspirations of aligning education systems and schools with the goals of making the world better. And we advance that mission through three interrelated set of activities. We conduct applied research. In the decades since we have existed, we have published about 20 books. We also convene informed dialogues, and then we develop practical tools, frameworks, protocols, checklists to help translate all of this knowledge into change practice. So these are some of our studies. There are more now, they don't fit in that slide, that we have conducted, essentially looking at national or large-scale efforts to transform the curriculum, but also programs to improve the preparation of teachers, or also programs to implement ambitious reforms at some scale. During COVID, in March of 2020, we pivoted because it was clear, with the schools interrupted, that we would not be able to go to schools and collect the kind of data that we had planned on collecting just the prior December. So instead, we said, how can we be helpful? And we conducted two comparative studies. The first was a study of what impact did COVID have on education systems in 20 different countries. And that is the book, that study was conducted between March 2020 and December 2020 and published in the middle of 2021. And we have just finished an update of that study, looking at the long-term impact of COVID. This book will be published, I hope, at the end of this year, beginning of next year. The second study that we conducted was a study looking at how universities during the pandemic had reached out to education systems for the purpose of providing assistance to teachers, to school leaders, so they could innovate and continue to teach even when in-person instruction was interrupted. We also conducted studies looking at innovations that had emerged during this pandemic. In this particular study, coordinated with a colleague at the International Bureau of Education in UNESCO, we looked at 31 innovations around the world that emerged during this pandemic, but that had staying power, and that 2 years after the pandemic were still having power. And we examined those innovations through the framework of the Commission on the Futures of Education that UNESCO convened. The second set of things we do in the Global Education Innovation Initiative is to produce practical tools, is to basically make visible the knowledge generated by practitioners as it pertains to designing and implementing educational change at scale. And so, for example, on the right-hand side, upper right-hand side here, is a publication titled Connecting the Dots to Build the Future Teaching and Learning. It's a very simple 7-step framework that suggests what is that should be done to transform the quality of teaching. On the left lower hand side is a publication that contains a series of reflections of system-level leaders, actually ministers of education, that led very ambitious education reforms. And then lastly, we develop things like curriculum. And so these are all curriculum resources developed in collaboration with my students, aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So enough about the initiative. A lot of the results of that initiative, and certainly the intent, are reflected in this recent publication of the Commission on the futures of education that UNESCO convened. And that publication, published in November of last year, basically suggests, as you probably know, UNESCO has only 3 times in its history tasked a commission of independent experts with the mandate of producing a set of ideas about how to align education systems with the changing world. The first time UNESCO did that was in 1968 when it asked former Minister of Education of France, Edgar Faure, to head a commission that produced a report, Learning to Be. Second time it did that was in 1992 when it asked Jacques Delors to head a commission that produced the report, Learning the Treasure Within. And the third time was now when it asked the current president of Ethiopia to chair a commission that produced a report titled Reimagining Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education. And what that commission did was to produce a report that has 3 sections. First section talks about what are the most pressing challenges of our times. Talks about democratic backsliding, recession in human rights, climate change, growing poverty and inequality, the new challenges created by the rapid, accelerated development of artificial intelligence. And it doesn't talk about COVID, even though we wrote the report in COVID, but it does talk about these other disruptions. Second part of the report says, so what is the implication for education of these challenges? And it says the implication is that we should prepare people to understand these challenges and to address them. And to do that, we're going to have to reimagine the very culture of education. We're going to have to reimagine what it is that we understand as learning and teaching and to what end. And to reimagine the culture of education is a task that will require the participation of everyone, not just of ministers of education, not just of school leaders, of every teacher, of every student, of every member of a community, civil society, as well as governments. This report is firmly anchored in human rights because the Commission believes that the idea of human rights is under threat throughout the world, that there are more challenges to human rights today than there were in 1948 at the end of World War II. And then the report says the most important element of reimagining a culture of education is to make sure that teaching and learning are authentic and relevant. What does it mean that they are authentic? That students understand how it is that what they're learning connects to issues that happen in the world. What does it mean that it's relevant? That students learn things that connect with values that are important today. And a reimagining of the culture of education should then be expressed in new forms of pedagogy, curriculum, the organization of schools, the very idea of who are teachers and how do we prepare them and how their work should be organized, and then connecting the dots of all the institutions that form the learning ecosystem. And then lastly, how is all of that going to happen? The report says through 4 set of catalytic actions. Number 1, broad and inclusive participation of everyone. Number 2, much greater investments in educational innovation and research. Number 3, committed participation of universities in partnerships with school systems. And number 4, reimagine forms of educational cooperation. But let me come back to curriculum and to the topic of tonight, educating students to improve the world. So basically, all instruction is based on a hypothesis, right? If I teach my students A, they will learn B. And if my students learn B, the consequences for themselves, for their communities, will be X, Y, and Z. But it is only the most reflective educators who actually take the time to formalize those hypotheses and to collect some kind of evidence, at least, or some notes, so they can go back after they have taught and ask themselves, did my students indeed learn what I intended for them to learn? And were the consequences for them, for their communities, those that I had imagined would be the consequences as a result of them learning B? But even when committed educators, reflective educators, test those hypotheses in some way, they usually do it privately. It's an individual exercise. It is very, very seldom the case that educators will make this knowledge visible, public, professional knowledge. And what I want to suggest is that it is essential that we make this knowledge visible, because that's how we can learn from the experience of our colleagues. And the reason it's important to do that is, of course, sometimes our hypotheses are just not correct. And if we don't reflect on the hypotheses, if we don't study them, we're going to keep on making the same mistakes. So let me give you an example of a field where there are a lot of good intentions that are achieving counterproductive results. And that field is climate change. So a couple of years ago, I read every evaluation that I could get my hands on that looked at um, assessing the effectiveness of climate change curriculum. And there are not very many of those, but I found about 200 studies. And the overarching conclusion is that climate change is teaching, in fact, the facts of climate change. It's teaching the science, but it's actually not helping students have any confidence that they can do anything about it or develop any skills that would engage them in creating any kind of mitigation or adaptation to climate change. And I think it's important that we pause on this example, both because the issue of climate change is so pressing, but it's also because it's a good example of the challenges of trying to make education authentic and relevant. So a lot of curriculum around climate change is built on a simple hypothesis, more or less as the one that you see on the screen. If we teach about climate change, our students will learn that climate change is a serious challenge, largely caused by human behavior. And if they learn those facts, they will undertake actions that will mitigate climate change. But as I've already shown you, the evidence that evaluates that hypothesis shows that that is just not correct. And you can find that chapter in this book titled Education on Climate Change, the Role of Universities. So in order for effective instruction to be authentic and relevant, it's important to begin with the existing knowledge base on when do you cause people to act, to develop skills that include not only knowledge of facts, but also the dispositions to act on what one knows and the actual skill to translate that knowledge into practice. So here's an example of a program which I evaluated some years ago. It was created by a group of former students very interested in advancing civic education, democratic civic education in Mexico. And what they did in that country, in their program, was to teach students over the course of a year in a civics course to identify problems in their community, to identify the root causes, and to do something to address those root causes. And then what I did in the evaluation, again, was an experimental study, was to assess before and after for a group that participated in this type of program and for a comparison group, the knowledge of students, but also their disposition to act on those problems. And what I found is that there are many different ways to teach students the facts about a problem, but it's only when you create opportunities for students to engage in the construction of some solution that they also develop the hope, the skills, the disposition to act on what they know. Anyway, so what I've done is to take, this is a synthesis produced by my colleague, Laurie Anderson, also in the International Academy of Education. It's a synthesis of what we know about effective instruction. And the synthesis of that research says that effective instructional tasks are a combination of assigned work with purpose, and that it is fundamental that students engage with authentic, relevant, and meaningful content if they are going to learn. So we know that most instruction is not of that sort. And what you will see here are findings from a survey administered in 2018 by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development to representative samples of 15-year-olds in about 70 countries in the world. And here's the answer to the question asked of these 15-year-olds Are you happy with your life on a scale from 1 to 5? And these are the students who respond 5 or 4, reasonably happy with their lives. So you'll see that in the US, it's only 60%. In countries like Kazakhstan or Albania, it's much higher. But in countries like Hong Kong, the UK, China, it's under 50%. And so think about that. This is the most educated generation of young people in history. These are the people in schools living perhaps at one of the best times in history. This was before the Ukraine war, certainly in material terms, one of the best times in history. And still we have an average, 40% of the people who are not happy with their lives. Same survey asked the people, do you think that your life has a purpose? Again, a scale from 1 to 5. These are the percentage of people who respond 5 or 4. Very similar to satisfaction, right? And not surprisingly, because one of the most important predictors of satisfaction in life is purpose. And so here we're essentially failing 2 out of every 5 students who are in school in helping meaning, purpose, and satisfaction for life. And if you look at results of that survey to teachers, what you see is that the manner in which teachers teach doesn't really connect to what I just presented you is the synthesis of research on authentic and relevant instruction. In other words, teachers are very good at talking, at presenting information in front of the class. Most teachers do that, but not so good at trusting their students to work on their own, solving problems, much less solving problems without giving them explicit directions on how to solve them, or solving problems over an extended period of time. What you see in the responses that teachers give to this questionnaire about how they teach is that there is a very small percentage of teachers who give their students a task, for example, for which there isn't an obvious solution. Very small percentage of teachers who allow their students to work in small groups. Very small percentage of teachers who let the students decide on their own how to solve problems or to work on a problem for more than a week. And I think these two problems are connected. When we engage students in didactic forms of instructions where they don't get to do anything, where they don't get to solve any problem, to make any decision, it is no wonder that students don't learn to solve problems. One of the findings of all the research that is going on about what happened with learning in the pandemic is that there was a lot of learning loss. But I think we should wonder, why was there so much learning loss? Why was it so hard for our students to learn autonomously during this period? It was hard because the way the school works, we don't get to practice the skills of learning autonomously. We don't learn to practice the skills of working on our own without very explicit direction from the teacher every so often during a school day. So let me now move to the second step of this presentation, which is to suggest that if we want to change this state of affairs, the place to begin is with real problems like climate change. And I have found it very useful to depend on this compact that outlines a very ambitious vision of a world in which we all belong and in which we can solve our differences in peaceful ways. And that vision was a compact approved at the General Assembly of the United Nations in September of 2015, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And you might wonder, how can we organize instruction around something as abstract and ambitious, a world without poverty, without hunger, with good health for everyone, with quality education for all, with gender equality, with clean water, and so on. So I'm going to illustrate how I have done that and some of what I have learned from doing it. These are 3 texts. They are published in many different languages, and they're very easy to find on Amazon and other online platforms. But the very first one on the left-hand side is called the World Course. It's a curriculum, a comprehensive curriculum from kindergarten to high school, 13 grades, aligned with the SDGs, in a course called the World Course, a course that would require 8 to 10 hours of learning and teaching every week from the first day of kindergarten till the last day of high school. It's a very ambitious curriculum. If you study it, you will recognize things that are not normally included in curriculum. This curriculum, which was developed some years ago, for example, has a unit, I think, in high school called pandemics, because the notion is that you cannot understand the 21st century if you don't understand the dynamics of pandemics, because they are one of the most important global risks that we face. I mean, we knew that before COVID. At least some people knew that before COVID. There are other units in this book that talk about demographic flows, migratory flows, how populations move, and so on. There are other units that talk about global conflicts. There are other units that talk about energy, talk about climate change, and so on. In other words, things that are not always taught in existing curricula. But in the schools that are teaching that curriculum, of course, the students find, and the parents find these very interesting, because the curriculum helps them make sense of the world in which they live. But it's a very difficult curriculum to teach because it requires fairly high levels of preparation of the teachers. The second book, the one in the middle here, is kind of a lighter version. Think of it as an introductory version of that curriculum, because it only requires 5 lessons a year. And these are lessons which can be integrated into the existing subject. So it doesn't require creating a new subject. And then lastly, the book Learning to Collaborate for the Global Common Good contains 13 different prototypes of curriculum, just to show that there isn't a singular way to do this. So the basic aspiration of these curricula, these were all developed with my former graduate students, is simply to illustrate how curriculum can be a very powerful lever to translate ambitious goals like the SDG into a set of competencies, knowledge, skills, and dispositions, and from there to map backward instructional sequences that are both coherently integrated, rigorous, and largely project-based. I'll just say a few words about the World Course, how we developed it. We developed it beginning with the end in mind, relying a lot on project-based pedagogy, relying on students actually doing most of the work. The idea was to develop not only knowledge, but also skills and attitudes. This every year is organized around a coherent. The basic idea is that this is a year-long course. It's not a series of little activities. This is a year-long project in which students work. The units make connections across disciplines. There's a lot of new knowledge and content, as I illustrated. And if there is one goal that would summarize what we try to do here, it's simply to activate, to cultivate the agency of students, their ability and desire to make a difference in the world, their initiative, their leadership, pretty much like my former students in Mexico were doing when they engaged their students in identifying a problem in the community, in examining the root causes, and then in getting on to addressing some of those causes, except that in this curriculum, students do that beginning in preschool. That curriculum is a lot about developing the capacity to see challenges, but also to spotlight silver linings and to learning from the silver linings to gain the confidence and the insights to tackle the more complicated issues. The idea is to develop an innovative and entrepreneurial spirit in students, to make connections between schools and their communities, to develop a breadth of skills, what some people call 21st century skills or deeper learning, to use the Sustainable Development Goals and human rights as the focus of the curriculum, make plenty of connections between the local community and global affairs, and essentially engage students with issues that are complex, messy, and that have no easy answers, built on the premise that students are smart. The curriculum is age appropriate, but it is not infantilizing. And it does take in general students from that which is most immediate and personal to more advanced and complex understandings. So I'll just take a moment. The big intellectual challenge in producing that curriculum was to articulate operational definitions of these competencies that the graduates should be able to demonstrate. And there are 180 competencies in this curriculum. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. So we organize them in 3 big buckets. Intercultural competency, which has 3 dimensions. One dimension is about relating to other people. Another dimension is how you think about the world and how you think about difference, intrapersonal. Another is an ethical dimension. There's a second bucket of knowledge and skills, organized pretty much in the buckets of several disciplines that you will recognize here. But the last bucket is what we call work and mind habits. So I'll give you an example. So let's take, for example, the first intercultural competency in the interpersonal domain. We then identified these with definitions such as the student is able to recognize and weigh diverse cultural perspectives, or their student understand their own identity as well as the identities of others and how culture shapes that identity, or the student can work productively in and lead effectively intercultural teams, and so on. You can find the 180 competencies in the two books that I just mentioned, in the World Course and in the 60 lessons. I won't dwell on that. Now, what we have learned, obviously, these materials draw on some of the research we're doing in the Global Initiative. And what we learn in the Global Initiative, beginning with this very first study that examined 6 very ambitious curriculum reforms in different countries, is that the curriculum is not self-executing, that you need to help teachers develop, and most curriculum reforms fail because they underestimate the investment that is going to be necessary in helping teachers develop the capacities to implement that curriculum. But we also have learned in our various studies that you need to think of teachers as individuals that work in organizations in the social context. So it's not enough to help the individuals develop the capacities to teach to this new curriculum. You have to support a process of whole school change. You have to work with a large number of teachers and others in the school so that they all have the capacities, not only to do that portion which corresponds to them in this curriculum, but to support what others are doing. And effective professional development is a very heavy lift. And so let me now talk about the need for effective professional development, which is a big area of research of the Global Initiative. But I'll start with a very simple protocol, which is in one of these books. I told you one of the things we try to do in the Global Initiative is to find simple tools that can translate some of these complex ideas into change practices in schools. And what we have in this book, in addition to the lean example, this lean example of 60 lessons, we also have a 13-step protocol for how to lead a process of school change that builds the capacities of teachers to teach to a more ambitious curriculum. And what are those steps? Well, the steps include essentially identifying and empowering a leadership team, taking the time to develop a long-term vision, studying these sustainable development goals, turning them into this framework of competencies. What do we want to see our graduates demonstrate that they can do, that they care about, that they're competent to do? Then using that framework of results, audit the existing curriculum. What are we already doing that is in line with that? Then decide what the next step is going to be, the next challenge. Then communicate and develop a clear implementation plan, obtain the resources necessary to support that, develop a monitoring framework, communicate some more, build the capacities of teachers, execute, and then evaluate, and then do it a little bit better the next time around. And what I have just described with this 13th step is basically a simple cycle of school improvement. But our hope is that if you have a range of schools using the same language, using the same tools, then you now have a school improvement network. Now you've made it possible for schools to exchange experiences and to learn from one another as teachers make visible their experiments in testing the 2 hypotheses that are at the foundation of every instructional task. Well, part of what we've done is to study how change scales, and here are some of our books. And the only thing I want to say about that is I want to share with you, if I had to simplify, what helps change scale or not is communication. And communication requires a theory of mind, a perspective about how it is that other people might be seeing the process of change. And so it's important to develop the ability to see the world of school change through the eyes of others. And what I do in this book, which summarizes a lot of what I have learned about how to empower students to improve the world, is to offer 5 frames, like a kaleidoscope, to see the process of change. And those 5 frames basically say, I don't believe that any one of those frames is superior to the other. I believe all of them to be true and complementary. And I think it is helpful to those of us engaged in leading change at scale to have the facility to simultaneously see the world through the process of change through these 5 frames. So one of those perspectives is cultural. Basically says schools are cultural institutions in interaction with other cultural institutions, families, societies, employers, civic organizations, and so on. And the task of executing change is one of finding good alignment, good communication with these other cultural institutions. But educational change is also a psychological process. It's fundamentally about people changing what they do and how they see the world and what they understand. This is true for students, but it's also true for the adults that work with them, for teachers and so on. So good educational change is understanding how people change and how they're motivated and how you get them to collaborate and how you get them to communicate effectively. And how do you activate intrinsic motivation so that they do their best work? But it's also a professional process. It's also a educational change is about deploying expert knowledge to support the process of change. So what are the structures and the norms and the routines? So the 13-step process that I just described is an example of a routine to generate professional knowledge as a result of collaboration in the school to implement a new curriculum. But educational change is also an institutional process. The educational system is a series of interlocking components and processes. There is curriculum, but if you only change curriculum and you don't change assessment, if there is not alignment, these are going to be like 2 gears that are not in sync. Or if you change curriculum and you don't create an engine to support teacher capacity, you're not going to implement curriculum. So you need to think about change systemically and need to make sure that all these gears are in alignment. And lastly, it's a political process because the education system touches upon the interest of many people. And everyone has an idea, a normative idea, an ethical idea of what the goals that should animate education should be. And it's important to build a big tent where a lot of these interests can coexist. So I think I should probably just stop here. I've given you enough idea so that we can have a conversation. But just to remind you, bottom line is let's take on ambitious goals. Let's actually try to prepare our students to make the world better because they're going to learn what they need. They're more likely to learn what they need that way. And they're going to be better partners if we do that. And I think they're going to find education more interesting. And to do that, we do need to translate that big concept of making the world better into concrete dispositions and skills and competencies that we hope our students will gain. And if we're going to do that, we're going to have to invest a lot and to do it well in helping the adults working with the students gain the skills to do that. And then if we want to make sure that all of these sticks for a long time and at scale, we need to see the world through the eyes of others. And one way to do that is to conceive of the process of educational change as a 5-step process. So that's what I wanted to share with all of you tonight. And I think now I'm ready to have a conversation with you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was very insightful, and we greatly thank you for your time for that lovely presentation. We'll be opening the floor up for audience questions, and we already have one in the chat, but I would encourage everyone to use the raise hand button or to type their questions in the chat so that we can go ahead and get started. Just so that we're going in order, because the question came earlier, and then we're going to go on to the raise hands. The question in the chat is around the 60 lessons and the 13 steps that have been mentioned. So they're definitely too much for most kindergarten teachers or even high school English teachers to grapple and implement. So is it possible to boil this pedagogy down to 5 actions?
Thank you for the question, Karen. In fact, we learned that lesson with the world course. It was too much for most teachers and most schools, and that's why we developed the 60 lessons. The 60 lessons are 5 per grade. So 5 for kindergarten, 5 for first grade, 5 for second grade, and so on. The 13 steps are not meant for teachers to be done alone. 13 steps are a process of change management that should be done by all the teachers in the schools together. Our experience has been that just as the world course was very difficult for most schools to implement, this one is really easy. And in fact, I have used it in working with schools as a professional development tool. Typically, it takes about 3 hours to explain to a group of 100 teachers in a school what I've just explained to you, and then to get them to say, how about if you now take these 5 lessons and you each develop one additional lesson per grade? And we're teaching them to align. And what I have seen is that people get it very quickly. They get into the rhythm of doing that, and then they go and they teach those lessons. And then once they get into this cycle of improvement, over time, they abandoned the original 5 lessons. They built a curriculum which is entirely of their own creation, which is exactly the point. So.
Thank you so much, Professor. We're going to go ahead and ask Monty. We see a raised hand.
Thank you very much. Monty McMurchie calling from Toronto, Canada. I'm a Harvard Kennedy School alum. And I'm back from Congo, where I do teaching pro bono en français in public administrative law. My comment to you, sir, following your most excellent presentation, in regions post-conflict where governance, shall we say, is challenging in not allowing citizens open, impartial speech, is that education becomes politicized on a variety of levels. Politicized economically, in the lacking of resources, and for those independent institutions, academic education, the administrative strictures that are imposed, calibrated, explicit in ensuring that they are not able to engage with the student in terms of provoking critical attenuation, of course, nonviolence. And I'm seeking from you, sir, your comments and suggestions, because shortly I'll be returning back to Congo. I thank you very much, sir.
It's a very good question, Monty. Education becomes politicized in many places, not only Congo, also in the United States, where the extreme polarization of American society finds expression in battles on school boards over what it is that students could read or should read, and so on. And I do think it is very important to remember that schools are both institutions that reproduce society as it exists with all its shortcomings, but also institutions that have enough autonomy for society to provide students experiences of what a better society might be like. And both things are true at the same time, even though they appear to be contradictory. In other words, in a society, for example, in which there is obvious discrimination, let's say about women, schools are going to reproduce some of that. It's going to be inevitable that the organization of the schools, the curriculum of the schools is going to transmit some of those norms. At the same time, even in those societies, schools have sufficient autonomy and educators to give students experiences that plant the seeds in the minds of students that a better world is possible. Now, the question is, how do you do that without risking the life of the teacher who's doing that? And there are tons of examples of that. I mean, think about, for example, in the United States, the people who taught African Americans when that was outlawed. For a good part of the history of this country, when we had slavery, it was banned for slaves were banned from receiving an education. And even after the abolition of slavery, there were serious limits on what could be taught, for example, about American history. And still, teachers found a way to teach African Americans to imagine a world that would be better, a world in which they would have full rights as citizens of their country. And so I have seen examples in societies in conflict, and sadly, there are many places in conflict nowadays, even in democracies that have been around for a long time. I have seen in those places that educators can use every space available to them to convey to students that a better world than the one which they experience outside the school is possible. So if the world outside the school is one where there is rampant corruption, teachers can teach to their students to think critically about what corruption does and where it leads. If the world outside the school is one in which there is a lot of bigotry, religious, racial, ethnic, cultural bigotry, teachers can create for their students experiences that cause them to think critically about that bigotry and to experience a different world, so that in hopes they produce change. So the only advice I have for you is obviously try not to get yourself in jail as you're working in Congo, and do the things that are possible within the degrees of freedom that you do and with your colleagues. But I am certain that in Congo, there are other educators that share with you the desire of preparing students for a more peaceful future than the one that they experience at present outside the school.
Thank you, Professor. We can move on to Abhinav's question. He would like to ask about your views on developing children as an agent of change for sustainable development. Are there any case studies related to this?
Yeah. So let me take one example, climate change. You've heard the name Greta Thunberg, a young woman who at the age of 14 told her parents, I think we should re-examine how we consume food here because I'd like for us to reduce our carbon footprint. And at the age of 15, she began a conversation in her school around the same topic and went to demonstrate in front of Parliament, demanding parliamentarians that they took the problem of climate change seriously. And at the age of 16, she had inspired a global movement of high school students doing the very same thing. I would say that on the issue of climate change, our students are leading change. They are ahead of their teachers, ahead of their professors, ahead of their school or university administrators. And I can tell you this is true at Harvard. We're just celebrating Climate Change Week. We began a year ago a serious commitment to climate change education. But there are many who would say that Harvard was kind of late in addressing this issue, and that we might not have addressed it had it not been for the activism of our students and graduates who were basically demanding, when are we going to do what we should, given our influence with respect to these, one of the most consequential challenges that we're facing as a species. And so I think that's an example. So we spent the last 2 days in meeting after meeting on climate change. And in a conversation we had this morning with the former Secretary of Education and two superintendents of Los Angeles and a large district in Arkansas, we were discussing how in many ways, our students already know enough to be concerned about climate change, and they are agents of change in education. They are putting pressure on the teachers so that we do a better job, giving them the skills they need to not only be concerned about it, but to know how is it that we can adapt, mitigate, or revert some of these climate change. So there is on this particular topic of climate change abundant evidence on all the youth activism and all the youth initiatives. So I do think that that's one example. If you look at the field of civic education, civic action, you can find plenty of examples of different programs that basically develop the capacities of students to solve real problems, that basically are built on the proposition that education shouldn't just be about preparing students to gain the skills so that one day in the future they can contribute to improve the world, but that can instead be built on the proposition that they can engage in improving the world as they are being educated, because doing it that way is actually a more effective way to prepare them to solve the problem. So I think those are some of my responses to your question. Or someone is sharing information. Monty is sharing some information. I don't know whether it's on that issue or not. On conversation, maybe it's about something else. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Another question in the chat is by Shankia. What may be the most important things to improve the learning ecosystem?
To get collective leadership, to get the very many actors that have the ability to influence a small piece of the education system to be in conversation with one another about what it is that our schools should be doing. And that's the premise of this report of the Commission on the Futures of Education. The premise is we need at the local level to bring together students and teachers and members of communities and parents around the question of what are the big challenges that we face in this community, and how is it that we're preparing students to face those challenges. And I think that if we do it that way, to go back to the conversation we had this morning with the superintendent of Batesville School District in Arkansas, he was saying at the local level, communities can come together around problems that they recognize. Their local problems, whether those problems are energy or jobs or what have you. And I think when the school finds a way to create that conversation that unites different people around their hopes for their students and for how their students need to develop the skills that will improve their own circumstances and the circumstances of the community, that's when you begin to see this alignment of the larger ecosystem. So I think it's creating dialogues, what I've elsewhere called informed dialogues, taking the time to slow down, to recognize that none of us is alone in this task of improving education, that there are other people doing it. So for those of us teaching, there are our students. And for those of us teaching young students, there are their parents and others in the community. And develop sufficient mutual recognition so that we can begin to talk about what do we want to do together and how can we collaborate.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Professor. And just before we close and give closing remarks, I think it's customary for us to take a picture. So I'm just going to do that. If I could ask everyone who can, please switch on your camera so that we could do this, and then we will close out.
So Elena, you were saying that you were my student 30 years ago?
Yes, I think it was 1995 actually.
So yeah,
in
so that
education
was
school.
yeah, but I was not yet a professor. I was working at HIID at that time, right? And I was teaching a module, a half a course. This was the course on education in Latin America.
In Latin
right?
America, yes,
Yeah, I remember.
exactly.
I remember you. Yeah, that's when I began to teach at the ed school. Yeah, I was doing that part-time. Eduardo, so good to see you. How are you doing? Oh, Eduardo just left us.
Just so that we can close this out, but thank you so much, Professor Reimers, for your time to chat with us and to enlighten us with that presentation. And many thanks to all of you who attended. Wherever you are in the world, we're thankful for your attendance. And I hope that you have a great day. Of course, feel free to stay on if you would like to have a chat. But thank you. See you next time.
Thank you all so much. I'm so glad that there is this interest group in the Harvard Alumni Association that makes it possible for educators in different parts of the world to come together. And I want to thank Zaina and Prachi for their leadership and others who sustain this community with you, because I think this is an example of the kind of informed dialogue that we need. I mean, it was so obvious during the pandemic, right? How important these venues were, how necessary it was to know that none of us was alone in trying to teach our students, that we had others. And so I think it's phenomenal that you have created this community of global educators who can keep some of you awake at 3 in the morning in Dubai. And I don't know what time it is for you, Zaina, in Ghana, but probably not very different, right? It's like
past midnight, actually.
just past midnight, exactly. And in Boston, it's 8 p.m. And Elena, where are you?
Well, currently in San Francisco, but yeah,
So
Peru
for
is
you, it's
like 3
it's
hours behind.
for you, it's 5 o'clock, exactly. So I think it's wonderful that you have this community that comes together from time to time, and I hope you can bring others so that you all have the benefit of being in relationship. You know, in closing, and my presentation is over, but I've read a fascinating book recently, which summarizes one of the studies, Harvard studies, that has taken the longest time, and it's still ongoing. The study has been going on for 100 years. And it's a study that began in the 1920s, trying to investigate what were the factors that contributed to the well-being of people. And every 2 years, this group of people was interviewed, and people came and took blood samples and saliva samples and hair samples and skin samples. And of course, some of those people have disease, and then their children are in the study, and their spouses are in the study, and the grandchildren are in the study. And the book that was published recently summarizing that research is called The Good Life. The Good Life. I highly recommend this book to you for several reasons. Number one, because the research is very interesting, the research itself. Who would like to guess what the single most important predictor of well-being is? What's your guess, Prachi?
Heart rate?
What is it? Heart rate?
Maybe if they were collecting
Prachi, you're on mute.
Other guesses. Other guesses. What's this?
Community involvement.
Community, yeah.
Relationships. It's the quality of your relationships with other humans. The people who have the better quality relationships with others, it's not the number, it's the quality of those relationships. They live the longest, the healthiest, and the happiest. And I think the reason I found that book so important is because I believe we haven't fully assimilated the tremendous harm that the pandemic caused to people, but in particular to those who were students at critical periods of their lives during the pandemic. Because not only were they deprived of those relationships, they did not develop the skills at the time when they should have developed them to build those relationships. And now, for example, that we have come back to in-person instruction at the School of Education, I observe a very, very big difference in terms of community relative to what we had before the pandemic, even relative to what we had during the pandemic. I don't know where the students are, but I don't see the same connection. I don't see the same. Elena, when you were a student here, you will remember Gottman was always full of students. There was always a buzz, and people were hanging in the library and outside the library and in the cafeteria. And that's not happening now. And I think it is one of the after effects of the pandemic. I hope it's temporary, but I've encouraged all of my students to read that book because I think it has practical implications for them. But as educators, it is a very powerful book for what we ought to do as educators in helping our students develop the skills to have those quality relationships. So anyway, the other book I wanted to recommend on related topics, and then I'll finish, is this book written by a Harvard graduate who happens to be the Minister of Education of Sierra Leone. And his name is David Moinina Senge. And the name of the book is Radical Inclusion. It was just published last week. And he was here discussing it at the Harvard bookstore. It's a wonderful book. It's a blend of a bit of an autobiography. David is fairly young, but he talks about growing up in Sierra Leone at the time of conflict, going to a United World College, coming to Harvard College, going to MIT to do a PhD in mechatronics, and eventually becoming the Chief Innovation Officer in Sierra Leone and the Ministry of Education. And one of the very first challenges that he tackled was the challenge of making sure that pregnant girls could continue to go to school, because the law banned that in his country. And he thought that was not reasonable to penalize these girls, many of whom were pregnant for reasons not of their choosing. And so it's a story about that, but it's also David's own story of dealing with inclusion. So it's a great book. Great book. Thank you all so much, Prachi. I read what you wrote, that your students are reporting high rates of loneliness and an inability to connect. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and maybe something like that is going on.
They don't want to connect anymore because they're like, we don't know how to, and it just makes us.
Maybe that's what's happening to our students right now, that they don't know how to. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you all so much for the opportunity to be with you tonight. It was a lot of fun. Thank you for inviting me.
Gracias, Fernando. Un gusto.
Igualmente, Elena. Qué gusto verte 30 años después.
Así
Bye,
es.
everybody. Bye.
Chao, chao. Nos vemos.
Bye.
Thank you.